Welcome back, everybody. This is the fourth episode of the Hope Axis. It's hard to believe because I feel like I started it 5 minutes ago. And we already had Noah Smith and Catherine D and Phil Clay as guests. We approach the question of hope and what it is out there still to hope for, to work for, from a variety of different angles. Sometimes we go at it from the media analysis, sometimes from economic analysis. We will have scientists later on and a variety of different practitioners, because we do believe that hope is something multidisciplinary and kind of both above and below as a foundation, under all the different things that drive us. So I'm so pleased today to be here with Erica Robles-Anderson, who is a friend of mine. And we were just kind of gushing before I hit record that, oh my God, we are doing a podcast with friends, and we're kind of using it as I think it should be used, which is a forcing function to update essays and write books faster and hone and fine tune one's thinking. Erica is a professor at NYU. You've been studying media. I think we're the same generation. So we are kind of the geriatric millennial, media obsessed, who remember the life before the internet, but were also there when it became extremely widespread. And we saw our own pop culture and politics being kind of engorged by this either monster or good monster, however you see mass media. And I think we all have very strong opinions about it. How much media do we need in our lives and what it can do for us. You also just completed a Stanford fellowship. Your beautiful Zoom background, for those of us who are watching us on YouTube, is a testament to that. It seems extremely cozy. Other people use backgrounds like this as a wallpaper. You're actually there. So congratulations about that. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that we can't wait to read all the things coming out of this journey. Do you want to maybe give us a little bit of an introduction about you? I feel like you are sometimes a lurker on the internet. There are people, with the kind of backstage knowledge who know you and know about your work. But you also sometimes like to just write for your own field and work with your own students. So first of all, thank you so much for doing something so public as a podcast that is also a video podcast. And do you want to share anything with this wider public now that we should know about your background or what you're excited about these days? Welcome to the Hope Axis.
Oh my gosh. Anna, thank you so much for doing this. I think it's probably a good time to say a little bit about me and why we're having this conversation, right? Like how is this, how do we know each other, So
what are we doing here? How did I get here?
Get here in split screen, because we are about the same age, right? And I grew up in Texas, so the United States, a very media savvy kid. I had young parents and few rules about media consumption. So MTV definitely was probably a third parent, right? And so I think you and I probably came into political consciousness and a sense of who we are as individuals and young women about the same time period, right? Like late 80s, early 90s. And so the feeling of the grand narratives that had structured geopolitics for like a while, right? The given sort of order of things really changed, and it changed really fast. And so,
although I saw MTV more like a drunk uncle as opposed to a parent. Right. Somebody that you should not listen to this person, but it's kind of this is cool.
I feel like I would have had the kind of parents who let the drunk uncle hang out, right? So exactly, yes, you got it, right? In a good way, but it's like you learn things. And I know we both really love books, and so the cacophony of that period, right? The media aesthetics of the late 80s, that jumbled feeling, that wall changing, Tiananmen, like the flood of books and ideas that were opening to people who had been sort of kept apart for a bit and been thinking about that apartness was just like, boom, right? Right about the time that you and I are becoming young women, right? Deciding who are we going to be and how are we going to navigate, right? And it's so precious because when you go back to those moments, it's like before 9/11, right? So the novel story that is going to arrive that locks the world in a different kind of grand narrative hasn't arrived. And there's this feeling like, what if, right? Like, what if? So I don't know. This is a kind of slow rollout, but I feel like it might be helpful to just stop and check in and see if that resonates with your experience, right? Because it's pretty precious, actually, that you and I are having this conversation on like Zoom, you know?
Definitely. I always feel that without the generational experience of the media, it's impossible to talk about it. When we say like if you say the word media to somebody born in the early 80s versus somebody born in the early 60s or early 2000s, different neurons will fire. Like this word means so completely different things to people. I definitely, grew up in a very TV-centered household. My parents worked in television. And so we had this kind of dual relationship with media where we were both the producers of it and the consumers. So you had this weird feeling, especially if you grew up, in a small country like I did, but it might be true growing up in a kind of non-central US state, right? If you're from Texas, there is a kind of art and media that comes out from that specific place, the kind of typical Americana of Texas, but you're not in Hollywood, right? And you're not in Atlanta, or you're not in New York City. You're not in a cultural production center. So you have, you watch Hollywood or you watch, the great British productions. And the fact that you are also a local producer of the media doesn't necessarily make you feel like you're on par. And so it's a kind of intersectional relationship. And I remember one of my first, I have very heavy historical or historic media memories. I remember Gorbachev from my childhood. Like I was very little, but I remember him. I always joke that, that I'm old because I remember Gorbachev before the Louis Vuitton commercials. Americans have these deep media experiences from millennials that tend to be, the O.J. Simpson trial, when the entire country stops for 5 minutes when they read up the verdict and I think they generated nearly $500 million in loss because nobody filled the gas, nobody flushed the toilet or switched on the light for 5 minutes. The entire country, it was very expensive. But you have the Clinton scandal, and then of course you have horribly the 9/11 kind of the visual legacy of it. Ethiopians also have, if you're Romanian, then and you remember the Ceausescu execution from December after Christmas 1989, then, one of your experiences is that your parents are really shocked. They are watching this thing, which was from tape, by the way, so there was a delay. It wasn't live. And you experience this thing that your parents can't protect you because they didn't know this was coming. Nobody knew that this.
That's right. Nobody knew.
I have a similar experience of my parents from my childhood. These are two fiction TV creators, and I remember I'm a kid. This was when before my mother was born, and I walk into the living room, and my parents are white with fear, looking at the TV, and I'm like, "What the hell? Like, why are you guys doing this?" And then I turned to the TV, and it was Twin Peaks.
Oh, wow.
And I had never seen my parents so scared in their lives. And it was the giant. There's the giant character. And I was like, what is so scary about him? And then as an adult, I watched it. I was like, oh, I get it. Wow. It's really, really, really scary. So we have those experiences, and they create.
Could I add one?
Yeah.
Could I add one? Just because you're reminding me of something I had not remembered. And like until this moment, like, wow, to have this feeling of comparing like same historic, like slice on time, different places, both what we think of as floating all over, right? Like the same, like, no, of course it's extremely different and regional. And so I'm remembering, and yet it's developmental, this, when this is so awful. When the first Gulf War happened, all the adults were, around the television screen, just completely obsessed with watching these missiles. It was really gruesome. Something as an adult, I, think of as quite gruesome. But because all of the adults were so fixated, we were all spending the night together and sneaking out at night as children and experiencing this little bit of freedom because, You could hide in the shadows of the adult's attention, right? In public space. Look, the way that when they get caught up at a party or something, you hide under the table and you notice the world, right? And like media is also part of that kind of fabric, right? Like you remember that your parents knew something about a text that you didn't yet know. And now you can sort of watch the layers of interpretation come online with story, right? And so these kinds of comparisons are just making me aware of that texture between us, you know?
I also have a memory of, I think the golf is also one of my first memories, because one of the people that were like, there were these, industry people who were frequenting our home, and they kept coming, and they were there all the time with their kids. And one of them was this journalist, and I remember him. And then I was watching TV. I don't know, I'm like 7 years old or 8. And the same guy, Gábor Kopvári, he's a Hungarian TV journalist. He's reporting from this burning oil field during the Gulf.
Yes.
So he's standing there. You remember these people, like they are sweating.
Oh, yes.
They're sweating with their mics, and behind them the oil is on fire. Yes. And I was just sitting on our sofa, and the guy was sitting on the same sofa not long ago, and now he's in like Kuwait or wherever reporting. And I really, really distinctly remember that moment of understanding that we are the media.
Wow, that's so early to arrive at that understanding.
And step across and step back. And so for me, when I think for millennials, for that reason, the fact that became a product on social media, because the real product of social media is that you can create the star quality around yourself as if you were being created as a star by a major media institution. So you can create the photographic kind of context, and you can promote yourself, which is what was happening on the Facebook wall. And was not even happening on the other competing social media walls at the time. And with the like button and the reshare, that basically became the new way of thinking about identity. But that felt a completely natural kind of result of an entire generation understanding that you can step across the looking glass and step back. And there's no audience entertainer. We are both all the time.
Exactly. Right. Like the idea of performance was already baked in the sense that there were multiple kinds of players in every room, and that you could work with that, and engage or disengage or like mediate it in some way. Right. And so I think that also seems to be, I think, part of our impulse to say, if you don't like how something is, right, you actually have some choices. It's a gestalt. And if you can move some pieces around and think of it as a opportunity for remediation, you might get to push things in a direction about story you do want to tell, right? And ways you do want to engage or hold space for many kinds of stories, because we're sure that whatever we're experiencing isn't the only possible experience happening at the same time, right? So I think in a kind of a more political and ethical sense, we seem to both curiously have arrived at a real kind of defense of mediations and holding open their possibility, and preserving space for that kind of multiplicity in public life, And so I think it's telling now, X years on, that we get to sit and watch geopolitics again, think about what grand narratives it wants to tell us about one another. And the media and technology stuff has scaled like a lot, right? We use it in more intimate ways. We have satellite Starlinks. We're on the brink of a new mode of automation, which is going to change like publishing and how we do print. Like all kinds of things are happening at once, plus massive systemic crises, right? Climate, like it's just overwhelming, right? And so how to move and navigate given that sort of cascade of overwhelms, and some that force us into austere, cold places, and others that open us up to hold on to one another's humanity. That part I feel like we have a shared deep interest in working on, right? And building up a language for so we can talk to other people about it. And I feel like whatever it is we're both doing in different domains, I feel like that's the kind of shared motivation that we bring and we haven't had a chance to talk about why that is or what that is, but I think this is it, the beginning of it. Yeah.
I love it. And I feel how you talk about the different eras of media and kind of communality, you're talking about hope.
That's right.
You're asking
very much. Exactly.
Still meet? Are we even to meet even better or faster these days? I mean, this is the eternal dilemma around the media or any kind of progress. Are we being brought together by? I saw this tweet a couple of days ago that the steam engine didn't bring people together. Like, yeah, it wasn't supposed to. But then you think, yeah, it wasn't advertised as such, but it did bring us closer together in the sense that, it freed up leisure time for communion. It sped up travel. You and I were hanging out a couple of days ago in San Francisco. Even neither of us normally lives there.
That's right. That's right.
We could be there, and we could have a real lunch and some amazing food, and have an offline conversation that happened because of technology. It would have taken me
we met on Twitter
to go there with the wagon, Yeah. I got lost or typhoid or something. So yeah, it was much better to just fly there and take an Uber. I really love that. Do you mind? I understand, and this is so beautiful how we kind of built up your generational background and the particular generational angle, when it comes to your interest in communality. But I would love to hear how is that represented in your academic work? You're talking about translation. You're talking about trying to find a shared vocabulary. For you as a professor, for you as somebody who writes, important papers for your field, how widely understood do you have to be? And is there understanding within your field? Is it because it's multiple generations?
Yeah. Gosh, what a wonderful and generous question. So let's assume, how would I like to take this? I think, let me put one piece in that I promise sort of I'll land the plane on, around technology, because that seems like it bridges between this sort of generational time, the questions of hope, how that grounds in academic work, and the era we're in, right? Which is deeply technological. So I did my undergraduate work here at Stanford, and my intention was to be something like an engineer, I guess, something sciencey, because that's part of why you come here.
Stanford, you kind of have this expectation, no?
Yeah.
You were classmates with Balaji. Do I remember?
That's right. We like to be the same dorm. Yeah, that's right.
So Balaji who was on Intern Time a while ago talking about network states. Erica Robles-Anderson. You studied.
That's interesting.
But you're right. In a weird way.
You can kind of. I agree. I agree. You're right.
That you are working on the same problem. I am as well. That's the generational part here. I think Gen Z,
at least some piece of it, right? Yeah. I agree. We're into it. So I would say we're working on forms of collective life, right? That's what I think I work on, right? And I think about how cultural sort of narratives shape migrations into new technological regimes by telling stories, histories, like original histories about transformations and forms of collective life. So I think probably in part I do it because I came here thinking, I don't know, something engineering-ish or design maybe, and thinking about things. And it was very clear that the kinds of things you build are grounded, not purposefully, but at least at that time, in the idea of an individual. So a commodity, a thing you can sell to one user, right? And then you can ideally scale that solution for big markets. And so I understand that as a market logic, but it seems like a thin description for meaning, because meaning tends to begin in collectives, communities, like kinship forms, like associations, context, right? And so we didn't really have a good way of, like, there's no user of like the kinship form. We were being too atomizing with our idea about the experience of engaging with the world. And so it seems like if we have all this technology, it would be beautiful to see, like, what if you had just as robust a set of programs around forms for collective life that began from that perspective and then dreamed up architecture, media, like forms, whatever along those lines. So for me, I've devoted my interest to that puzzle for my entire life. And to do that kind of work, it became increasingly obvious that I needed to go find examples where other communities had taken that collectivity first approach and then use that to drive how they decided to innovate or invent new things. And so I just started making lists of places I thought you could see it, right? So that I transformed from, at that point, being like doing experimental psychology and lab studies. I'd become an engineer, so quantitative social science. Like, oh no, I need to go learn how to do history and field work, right? Because the kinds of stories I want to tell about an alternative world can't come from this dominant logic that has already decided what it's going to prioritize producing, right? So you have to take a turn. So here I'll land the plane on how the work grounds. The first organization that I found that trumped like all the other organizations for showing what you can do with mediation is the church, right? Religious organizations have been mediating eternity forever and deciding how togetherness works so that you can experience like the most sacred, important thing that people think about, whatever it is they think, right? And they invest a lot. I mean, they've been like the vanguard of technological stuff like many, many times in their history. And it's still these massive capital sums that allow for transformations and experiments. So I started thinking, maybe if I told a story about, let's say in that case, the rise of megachurches in the 20th century, that was a forcing function to open the lens so much wider and thinking about where change comes from, what kinds of like people are telling innovative and inventive stories, why telling stories in ways that hold people together matters, all of the many forms you can do. And so my work from here is often sort of a march through trying to show other people that we can broaden the sense of what we think makes change in the world and start to do these kinds of learnings and experiments together by translating across domains where collectivity is first and foremost, right? We want to get that done.
Thank you so much. I love that you say the mega church. I mean, I remember when I started interning life and everybody tried to convince me that this is a cult. And it was like, no. Cults it's a different thing. You don't use this word, irresponsibly. But people were trying to get at pastoral work, and you mentioned churches, but when it comes to America, for instance, the military is pretty good at keeping
absolutely
actually. I have many friends who grew up as military brats, and I was in conversations where like a Mormon friend and an army brat friend were, comparing notes on like how communities are organized and how they work, and it's really similar.
I bet. And this is so understudied.
Absolutely. And I this is why I always say that, on the surface, Europe is kind of always lefty and America is always kind of like right-wing on the surface, right? But if you look closer, it's Europe that is fundamentally on the right, where you have these old clan systems and kingdoms and a very kind of stuck way of thinking about society. Far more stuck than America. I would die on that hill. I lived everywhere in Europe and I've been everywhere in America, and I'm telling you that this is how it is. Whereas in America, you have this, there's no community, we have to make one. It's right. And people ask me like, how can I run this community? I'm like, I can build a community because I don't have one. And so I look at it from like, in von Bartholomeu has this thesis about systems. Like if you basically want to understand how a system works, take away one part and see what happens. Or the kind of famous version of this is like, try to build it yourself. And it's always the outcast. It's always the immigrant. It's always the third culture kid or the weirdo or somebody kind of like the odd one out who, if they have communal ambitions and talents, will figure out how it works. Somebody living in a European community and kind of being born into it, you don't have to, like, I'm sorry, but if you're like born into a middle-class family in like Rome, you don't have to think deeply. You can think deeply about the health of your community, but it's not going to be a from scratch affair. And I think in America, it's a from scratch affair. And there's a reason why mass culture comes from here. and why these mega churches exist here. Those are kind of the extreme manifestations of something that I think every individual American or individual living in America experiences themselves. You're not given something. The only people given a community in America are usually some very fundamentalist thing where the rethinking will happen because of that. Because if you're given something, it's a lot. It's not like being born as a middle class atheist. If you're born into a community in America, you might be being born into a commune, and you will have your journey deciding whether you want to stay or not. And to me, that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very interesting.
Also very hopeful. Making a community is hopeful. Like, what is having a child and building a community or building a house? These are like the three acts of hope in this life. Maybe so.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And I think it would be really nice because there's so much sort of American impulse to experiment with that stuff, right? We're forever associating process, right? That it would be nice if we had, like, in my imagination, someday there will be like centers, kind of like when you go to the library as a public resource where you can, that are set up to like share public facing knowledge and spaces in service of people like experimenting with like ways of living, right? And we would have the fluency and the foresight to record people's experiments, whether or not they were successful or not, right? Whatever that means. But we would care for and pay attention to those models the way we care for and pay attention to like data corpuses, or, like there's a whole set of things that are like called important. Now we devote science to them. And then all of these ones we under science, even when we have the resources. And so it seems like this place where you could have a library of examples or people who are good at translating grammars and styles and moves and multiplexity, right? Or the kind of fundaments of these things forward. You could micro grant to kind of provoke small experiments at different scales, right? We could build this up and then also have space so that people can shift and try out norms for set periods of time, right? And in my brain, like this exists, and like that's what I would want to live in and build and contribute to, because that seems like such the kinds of things you would want to have as a social research form for the next 100+ years, right? Like
it reminds
we can't do it if we don't learn it.
Is architectural experiments like the Israeli Yonah Friedman, La Ville Spatiale, the spatial city, or Le Corbusier in Marseille, the l'Unité building, right? Which is a building, but it's every brick in that building or panel of concrete is an expression. It has some kind of communal function. And then we just stopped building these things for some reason.
Right. Well, we got into that big story about the communals versus the individuals, right? The Cold War part that gave us this feeling that that's a binary, right? And it's a good versus evil level, like deep difference, as opposed to thinking like we know that these are often performances and there are no a non-collective place. There's no such thing as a lack of collectivity, It's not Thatcher's world. There's no such thing as society. All of that stuff is always there, holding up the prospect of individual expression. And so it's not a false, it's not a binary. And we could maybe do a little better, hopefully, by learning from the master planners that is not a kind of sustainable, enduring, ecological, and generative way to live, right? We could do better, but then we have to admit that we're doing, right? Which is a hopeful position. Like, otherwise, why would you be doing?
There's also, when it comes to community, there's also the family, right? Like, what is the scale of the community? And when you talk about family, tradition becomes, like, it's easy to be traditionally related to something from 2,000 years ago versus 12 years ago. So if like Le Corbusier was your like parents' generation, then, in the 80s, kids rebelled with electronic music and being yuppies. And, the hippism was past. You can't really help that. All you can do is try to find higher level traditions where somebody's misgivings about their own parents, won't even come into play with how they see something that's socially useful.
Yeah, I mean, you get the right as an author, right, to play with the levels. It doesn't always have to be parts assembled from what is literally related to you or near you. I mean, part of the joy, I think, for both of us as readers, right? Girls who read books, like growing up, is that you feel the difference between what it's like to become a woman, right? Where lots of things are projected on you and you have to make all kinds of decisions about what to author and what the risks are and what you'll author and authorize while living this wild-minded life, right? Like full of the voices of people who are promising kinds of freedom and difference that you're not seeing in the local environment, right? And so if it weren't for that kind of the friendship of the dead who never intended we'd be at the table, I wouldn't have been able to make it through being like a 13-year-old girl, right? Like, thank you, Leo Tolstoy, right? Or whatever, right? For thinking about this tragic woman.
Margaret
right?
was negotiating.
Right.
Maybe it's
exactly.
more communing. I always see maybe this would be a good point also to talk about some of your current work, because I always feel that, we say communication and community. And I mean, everybody with some spelling skills sees that these words come from similar places. And in your case, this was literally the case, right? So you went
literally the case.
How communication works on the code level to saying what other codes there are that are not expressible in binary numbers necessarily, or they are, but they shouldn't always be, and who communicates, right? First, when we study communication, we think what, right? What is mutual information and whatever. And then you say, okay, but why and who? And then you are talking community. And
that's right.
Always how this jump led even more recently to your interest in human suffering. I mean, the paper that you sent me, as a way to prepare. I mean, we did discuss it, but you very kindly shared a work in progress text with me, and I would love for you to just tell us a little bit about that. But also a bunch of, different questions. And so this morning I reread the book of Job, which was absolutely not my original plan for this morning. And, you kind of open up all these questions that also deeply interest me when it comes to human suffering. And I'm just really curious how we go, what is the logic psychologically or in just terms of philosophy that drives us from communication questions to matters of community and then to suffering. So if communication is the what, and then we go to the why and the who, or is community the who and suffering is the why, or how should we think about this?
I love that. It's such a good jump. It's so we could think about the communication, right, as this desire to send a signal between point A and point B. And hopefully, if in some slightly platonic understanding, if it gets to you intact, we would agree on what it means. Right? That is a sheep, that I'm thinking of, and so are you now, right? But we know that never works out, right? Even everyone has felt the pain of being in a conversation where you speak all the same words, you have the same cultural life, and you cannot make sense of one another, right? It's like a profound sense that there's something to the mystery of meaning holding together, community.
We have to have a conversation at some point about the silence. Derek Bergman's The Silence, which is one of my favorite movies, which is
absolutely
about this, right? There is actually silence in the movie. They talk a lot. They just don't understand each other, either because of emotional reasons or because it's a mysterious language. And the two women travelers and the little boy, they don't actually understand. And
right. And you're sort of, in a way, born into these conditions, right? You arrive in a world already rife with signs, codes, meanings, feelings. You're just plopped in the middle, And so a lot of life is spent trying to figure out what to do about it. And you can, in at least the contemporary context, you can feel that anxiety and fantasy about what it is words and codes could do when we think about like disinformation and information and accuracy, right? Like if only we had a community note, then finally we would know the truth and agree, and there wouldn't be a fight here. Like, no, it's not an information problem, right? And so if we treat things from the frame of thinking of communication as information, then you're talking at this level, but that's the frame of solutions and beliefs that can be offered, right? So sort of step one to get to communion and community is to notice that those signals are doing something sociological and anthropological. They're allowing a context to hang together enough for continued interactions to keep happening, right? So we get along with good enough agreements, sort of, kind of, based on all kinds of cues. And sometimes you can actually stack like rather different perspectives in a ritual context in order to show the people that they're part of the same thing. So when I go to like a rock concert, I might be there with people whose political beliefs I find abhorrent, right? But in that ritual, effervescent moment all together, we become like a we, in part because the difference between us confirms it's something special and bigger than ourselves, right? So I'm very interested in that kind of work and what sorts of aesthetics, architectures, stories you can use to work at that level of human experience. And so one thing that you start to notice when you start looking really carefully at this, and maybe here's where I would depart from a lot of the contemporary language about community, is it's not always good there. Like sometimes really bad things happen to people and scapegoats are around. And in order for the community to hang together, they can do some pretty horrible things to one another, right? And to people who are not empowered within them. And so I'm very wary of using a language ever that assumes that community or family or whatever is inherently good, or even that care is inherently nonviolent. That's up for debate, right? But those are the kinds of things that if we looked a little closer at, we should also pay attention in a real way to what we're going to do about the question of suffering, right? And because it's so core in that space as well.
Say more about care not necessarily being non-violent.
We know, right, that most violence people experience is always operated in the home or from intimate relations, and people who are supposed to, it's going to be children, it's going to be people who are put in some form of like hopefully loving authority and charged with care, right? And so if we think about ourselves as living in a world that is like dry and disenchanted and economic, as if care then becomes the answer, it sort of flattens over a whole set of difficult ethical puzzles and histories. So I'm saying, we could start to dive down and work in that area and think about the questions of communion and community in light of the fact that we're sure bad things are going to happen to good people, right? And so what do we make of that, right?
You start your essay with that sentence that we know that we all know.
We know, right?
To good people, and we don't know what to do about it. Because way of kind of hedging against danger is by good behavior, right? Like we do it almost as harm, and all the relevant stuff is just a later derivative of the superstition that, first correct behavior is just to not put your, fist in the mouth of the bear. But then that is extrapolated in human psychological evolution, right? Like correctness becomes it goes from danger avoidance to moral danger avoidance. We can imagine that like maybe 100,000 years, it's not fast. And then when our ideas of correctness breaks down, and I think this is why you bring up Job, he's accused by his friends in the book of Job that all the suffering befell him because of something bad that he did. Whereas we know from the prologue that it's just, God testing him, basically, whether he would be as pious, would he lose everything that he owns and loves. And so we don't know what to do with the unfairness of the uncaring universe. We don't know what to do with it.
We don't know what to do, right?
No. Still, we're sitting here, and our ancestors, could conceive of this age, and there are these two women sitting on Zoom, and still saying we have no idea. We produced all these tenures, all these intellectual celebrities. We burnt people at the stake. We burnt the witches. We did everything. We fought world wars to figure out who's right. And we still don't know what to do with the unfairness of life. We don't even understand if it's unfair.
Exactly. We don't even know if it's unfair.
Like we are
Is it or is it not?
very unproductive at figuring
Yeah.
out the great questions of life.
Yeah. Right.
Like we are productive, but we are not very efficient apparently when it comes
Oh,
to
God.
actual
Yeah.
solutions.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is probably another one of those texts that you encounter early in that adolescent moment, but it's like an enduring text that many, 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 many generations have encountered before. And it stares you straight into this question of what you're going to make of suffering. And so I think, I don't know about you, but I think when I first read it, I was like, wow, like this is a story about how like God is a jerk, like, wow, like this he's gonna take this bet, like kinda to like make this person like have like boils and like his children die. Right. It's awful just to prove a point. Like what this is awful, right? And so it as a teenager, it's like, oh, right. I always projected, I didn't think about myself as Job, like I'm so good, but I did think like authority, man, like this is what I'm saying. There's problems. So there's a kind of, right. I don't know if you had that experience.
The people are jerks as well. Everybody's a jerk.
Right.
Everybody but Joe.
Right. Right. And it's like none of us are so good we get to be Job, right? Like, oh, we've all been a jerk sometimes. And so I couldn't get this text off my mind after like decades, whatever, but then COVID happened. So man, that was like a global natural experiment in like bad things happening to people who didn't do anything, right? All at once, if like media level, right? So we're both in the 21st century. It's like, wow, we can go in 2.5 months to a virus that is like unknown but deadly, be all over the entire globe. And we have so much media connection that we can watch it happen to each other, right? And all the different responses. And we're all at home, just watching this unfold, unable to do things, right? It was an extremely unusual historical context, and I couldn't get Job off my mind. I was just, I wasn't sleeping. I was thinking about this. It's such a media story, to our point of like the Patriot, right, bombs, the televisions that you're all glued, all the adults in the house are like this. The children think we're crazy. Why are we washing the groceries? All of that tension of the domestic has also happened. And in 20 years, we're going to hear, right, the kinds of stories that we're telling about this moment. So part of it is the desire to just now start to knead these questions together. I'm going to pause there because that was a lot. And does that resonate with?
Absolutely resonates. One thing that I would ask for you to do you mind just maybe defining what type of suffering you're looking at? Or like if you were to create the Erica Robles-Anderson thesaurus, what would the entry for suffering say?
Oh my gosh. Wow. So I would have to punt by saying like there are no major religious traditions that I think have not taken up the question, right? So I don't know if I can do it, but I would say I at least believe it's a universal condition and that people experience it as something that makes where they are and the world they're waiting on have some sort of gap. Things are not as they wish they could be, and it creates a sense of unease, right? So it could be small or big. Does that feel satisfying?
Yeah. So basically, like when it's bad.
It's bad.
When people feel that it's bad, correctly or incorrectly.
Yeah, right? and you want to do something, probably. Maybe not. You could bear it, right?
I once tried to define goodness for myself, or feel, because I do think that morality is objective, because there are situations where any reasonable person would feel that it's good, and not in the kind of Kantian way. Yes, later on, it can lead to something bad,
right?
In the causality and the complications of the world, every bad thing at some point will lead to something good if you look far enough, right?
Right.
We just feel the weirdness of it when it happens very soon, and we're still keeping track. And I have this theory or a way to formulate it, which is that goodness is like what comfortable temperature is for the body is goodness is for the soul. Because when there's goodness, when there's the kind of soul temperature is right, the soul comes out to play.
Uh-huh.
Right?
Wow.
And it's bad when it's like the equivalent of scorching or freezing temperature,
Right.
the soul hides. You have this look in the eyes of people who are experiencing suffering, especially if it's inflicted upon them by another person in the form of violence, that they hide themselves. They are not giving it. Like one thing you want to do with a person, and this is why a lot of kind of gaslighting is so dangerous, is when it's open violence, the self hides itself, right? The survival instinct is even bigger in yourself than in your body, because if like your body can be rebuilt, but yourself not necessarily. And we have this almost, very deeply religious instinct built in that you hide it. You're not, you become just a body. And you read it in the Bible accounts from really, atrocious violence in the history of mankind. And this also makes me believe in the existence of the self, or at least the self thinks there's a self, because there's something that you hide in these moments. And then there's something that you let out to play, like children from a house, like you as a mom, you let out your kids to play when you feel it's safe. And your soul, when it's like you're in a social environment or in a natural environment where you feel that your soul would benefit from being outside, you let it out. And to me, that's goodness is this ideal temperature. And I do think that is as objective as it is for the body.
That's amazing. And I'm going to be thinking about that like for a very long time. And it gives me a great sense of trust, actually, that if I know that's where you see the good, that there will be good temperature around you to play in.
It's grace. Maybe it's called grace, right? But I believe in grace as the good temperature.
I love that so much. I also believe in grace and not religious, but agree totally. I'm very friendly to religion. Okay, so I wanted to just read you like one tiny piece of Job for like to this point. So he seems like someone who is like not withdrawing himself, right? To your point, totally. So this is just one of the many translations, but he's describing his misery and saying like, I sit and gnaw on my grief. My groans pour out like water. My worst fears have happened. My nightmares have come to life. Silence and peace have abandoned me, and anguish camps in my heart. It's like there is no hiding self here. He is like full-throated, loudly, with the total soul suffering, and so it raises this question: what if the good is happening, right? The good temperature has arrived and the soul is playing, and what you hear from someone is this level of anguish and suffering, because sometimes that's going to be the truth. And like, we've all been there, and we would even want to hold that space open potentially for others. But it hits this wall for ourselves of now having to question, is this fair or not, right? What to make of this kind of experience happening to another person, given the broad stories I had to think about what makes the world real or the frame appropriate. We do this to each other all the time.
One of the great tragedies of our contemporary lives that we don't know how to handle other people's suffering.
Right.
And
exactly.
I have a friend who is a death doula. And her job is to be there when people are dying. And she tells me that she feels not just that she needs to represent this ancient ritual of being there with somebody, sometimes they are semi-conscious, but sometimes they are going through great suffering in the last days, right? Depending on the cause of death or the cause of being, because of those being your last days. But she also feels that she's teaching a lost art to the family, because a lot of times, it's the family members or the, whoever is there is making it so much worse for the person who's suffering, because the dying person also has to comfort their own relatives. And it's, the death doula comes in and just, reteaches something this natural as saying goodbye to somebody. And I feel the same way. I mean, I think we're just kind of entering the age where people will get divorced and people might get more serious diseases. We're becoming middle-aged, millennials, right? And And I know from my own life that when I was recovering from a very serious trauma in my life, I knew instinctively that this was going to take me 7 to 10 years because my entire life had fallen apart and my own sense of self, and I will have to rebuild it. And I was functional throughout, maybe not for like 2 days, but I was completely functional. But internally, I still sometimes today feel that I'm still in survival mode a little bit
Right.
and hopefully as
Right.
back where I was before. But I remember this kind of impatience in my friends that, okay, you've been crying for 3 months, now get a grip
Right.
because you're inconvenient for people. And I was like, no, because human suffering takes a really long time. And they didn't know it yet because it hadn't happened to them yet. We have this glorious, luxurious existence where, many people lose their parents when they're not even middle-aged, but old. Right. And
Right.
for a lot of people don't experience any suffering for a very long time. And so they don't know what
Right.
other people does. And I'm not wishing any suffering on anybody, but I'm wishing everybody a better understanding and an ambition to find the vocabulary of how to deal with it. Because I think we're aggravating the situation for each other if we don't know how to do it.
Yeah. So I think, wow, that's it's so wise of you to have known that it was going to take a while, right? And maybe hopefully for that to give you the space to know that when others wanted to rush it, that didn't feel appropriate to your sense of who you are and what is truth for you, And so one would hope that you could say, like, that's not my path. I'm going to take the time I take. And your friends could say, well, I don't understand it, but I don't need to understand it, right? And so taking the extra step of not, where Job's friends kind of can't go because they're so locked into what it has to mean. And they're so erudite and accomplished, right? That they're like, well, look, it's been 3 months. Be rational about this, right? That's like practically a quarterly report in like stock market. It's like there's some magical logic. There will always be a magical accounting logic for why things should be the way you imagine would make the whole thing fair, right? And trying to take, what I think you described to us, some ambition to say, wait a minute, I absolutely don't know, right? And maybe even COVID was a great experience. And like, I don't I didn't get COVID, long COVID, right? People did. I don't think they deserved it, right? And so we don't know what comes from that because we've never been here before. We don't know if in 20 years what they'll be fine. We don't know, right? And so we're going to encounter more and more things like this, right? People who move from places because of like climate change, where we've never been before at this scale, or people who want to go to Mars, or people, something we aren't going to know. And so the question is, can we think about a way of staying in community, given some forbearance for the fact that the language of their suffering and the frames of its meaning may not correspond to our own? And is that a form of friendship, right? Can we build the community sort of structures that support the language for exploring this aspect of human relation? Because that feels important, right? We should be attending to it and writing and thinking. Yeah.
I'm very interested. I didn't really pick up on the rationalization in the book of Job, but now that you're mentioning it, the friends, and I would love for you to say a little bit more about the 3 friends and what they offer. And then there is this 4th character who just like shows up and also offers a take. Because I think I think our listeners and viewers would maybe feel a little bit seen, quote unquote, in the argumentation of these 3 people. Do you maybe want to share a little bit about how these people show up? And I mean, we discussed one of them. I think one of them, I forget the name, but one says this thing that, oh, you must be a sinner, right?
Right.
We love that. A very good friend of mine is an onco-psychologist, and she deals with cancer patients and doctors and nurses and relatives. And she always talks about, like, one of the most difficult things about treating a psychology patient or client who has cancer is the self flagellation. It's the guilt.
Right.
You can have the most congenital, weird, rare cancer. You will have a patient who will be like, oh, it's because I didn't communicate well with my mother. I gave this to myself. And she sees her job basically almost as like getting the patient out of this mindset because it's so unfair and unhelpful. And you're already suffering. Why are you giving yourself more suffering, right? So there are so many. I think when you hear the arguments of the friends in this scripture, in this part of scripture, these are modern arguments, is what I'm trying to say.
Oh yeah, I mean the book feels so modern, right? Actually, it's so good. I mean, it's really like one of the finest little texts there is. But his friends show up after he's lost so much. This sort of upright man from the land of Uz, and he's kind of a patriarch, sort of a big dude, known about the far and wide. So when his friends come and they're quiet and they sit next to him and they put up with this for 7 days and nights, like rolling in the dirt with them, with the tearing of the clothes, and then they've kind of had enough, right? And so they keep using what for them is the best skills they have at their disposal. Like these are learned people who know their religious texts well. It would be the equivalent of like scientists of the day coming to explain, right, or challenge. And so they're doing this kind of like back and forth questioning. And Job was really like not having the same shape of conversation that they are. So they aren't quietly sitting with the suffering. They can't help is the truth because it's not theirs to help. But they nevertheless are producing an enormous amount of chatter that tries to help prop up and justify their worldview, right? And so as a grown-up, right, if it's like as a teenager, I was like, man, this God character is like awful, right? As a grown-up, I think like, well, the least I could do is try to not be like Job's friends. The very least, that's within reach. I can understand that I could be that person, and I'm sure I have been, right? I know it all, or I think I understand. I've got the read of the room. I know what truth is, right? And as a non-believer who works for unbelievers, I think that matters too, right? The least I could do is do better than those guys, because when you're hearing the text of the suffering, everyone in the room is feeling like no one's proud of those guys, and they are not fully bearing their soul or asking these kind of cosmic questions. So why is there no forbearance for the journey that is for their friend, right? And so for me, that's the turn, right? Is what kind of friend could I be given I will encounter Job's, like, or people in that moment of Jobness in their own life.
And the lack of compassion. They don't see themselves in Job, which is so shocking these days, right?
Which is sad, right? I mean, I don't see myself in Job, but
everybody's like, that's you. Good to you.
Yeah, right.
I will provide an outside perspective on your suffering, but don't drag me into this. Don't get me involved.
But that's perfectly said. You nailed it, right? I will provide an outside perspective, but don't drag me into this. Like, I don't think you can have it both ways.
The whole, kind of inciting incident in this story, to use a screenwriting term, is, it's basically Satan saying to God that this dude Job is only so big, a fan of yours because he has all this good stuff, wives and livestock and money and whatever. But take those things away from him and he will curse you. And God allows Satan to do all these things, right? Which is a very interesting, Talmudic debate. Like, why does God give permission to Satan to do this thing? Why are they playing a game, with the poor little human?
Right, with a person's fate, right?
Yeah. And it's, but it takes a very long time for Job to even start, doubting the eternal benevolence of God. And the famous line that we say in, every funeral in the Western world, which is God giveth, God taketh away, comes from the book of Job.
Yeah, that's right.
And they test him. And then there's this beautiful idea where Job says that, I came into this world naked and alone and having nothing, and this is how I will leave. And this is it, right? In Christianity, in the Christian scripture, in Jesus' teaching, this comes back again, where the rich man can store up all this stuff in his barn. When he dies, he can't take it with himself. And we think, of course, but at the time of like people burying swords and cats and jewelry in tombs, this was not an obvious thing that you can't take what it is.
I mean, it kind of still feels that way, right? Given like estate farms and inheritance, right? Or like, accumulation, billions, right? It still feels like a kind of pile of something somewhere that you wish you could take to the land of the dead, right? Or never have to go there. And so you don't get to opt out of these questions, which, is deeply humanizing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a different thing to leave a legacy, like an intellectual legacy, but the fact that you can't But what was very interesting to me rereading it yesterday and today was how, the test by Satan allowed by God is whether Job would continue to praise God in his suffering, whereas the real question becomes, do his friends stay his friends after he has lost his stuff? It seems like, and we know this from real life, like when you're going through, real hardship, it's a really big test. And also, I mean, I don't want to be a hypocrite here. Like, I am the same way. If, somebody, is really demanding a lot from me, that's also a moment for me to check, am I really a friend of this person? Do I give this thing? And I think we all test for both sides.
Yeah, or is understanding as prerequisite for my friendship, right?
Yeah.
Like, right? It's like, at some level, it's like, do I need to ask for an account of why you deserve, like, people, bad fortune comes, and having my friend thinking, well, actually, I could kind of see it coming, or, it's like, that's not really relevant to the work of trying to build out that political, ethical, aesthetic vocabulary for forbearance. It's, because it's an essential part of the social fabric, and that feels, I think, part of what I love about the work you do is people come together and they have different perspectives. And so you have to hear a little variation, even if you think you're alike or different. And that builds, I think, some of the capacity and muscle for going after these questions of forbearance, what we owe to one another.
Well, before we fully run out of time, I really would like to just bring up something that I've been thinking about and hear how you think about this. So when we talk about suffering, we're really kind of talking about three different things, right? You can have pathological suffering, which is something happens to your body through an accident or a disease. And you have objective, I mean, except when you're a woman, because then, of course, you're just like exaggerating. But if you're a man, you can have objective physical suffering that people, care to. And then you have what we try to call maybe systemic suffering, when society puts you into a position where whatever you do, that's your lot, and you have to deal with it. You want to end your suffering, right? And then we have something that I often think about, but that seems to be a little bit underexplored today, which is moral suffering. And it's not psychological suffering or emotional suffering, it's moral suffering. When you create a bad moral situation for yourself, and then you feel morally dead there, or you are made to compromise, etc., etc. And I think that our era is completely confused about these three things. And we constantly mix them. And because, in my view, systemic, pathological, and moral suffering all demand for different action and rights and responsibilities. The fact that we are gaslighting ourselves and each other and are confused about the vocabulary and have no public platform in which to double check terms and categories about this, it's terrible for everybody. I sometimes feel like one thing that Interintellect provides in a weird way is this kind of intellectual group therapy where you can talk about moral suffering or intellectual suffering.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Agnes
that's
Miller,
right.
she's coming on Interintellect, and she will talk about her piece the Eros monster, in which she argues that Eros is an intellectual monster. When you are like sexually obsessing over somebody, which is traditionally seen as kind of erotic anguish, it's an intellectual anguish. Then it's the person is always on your mind, and it's an intellectual thing, and I just love that.
That's beautiful. Yeah,
it's a verbal devil or verbal evil, and that we are so confused. I know this because I experienced moral suffering at some point in my life, and it would be labeled as, say, pathological or systemic suffering. It's because you're a woman, right? It's because of your whatever. And I was like, it's not a physical problem. I fucked up.
Right.
So
exactly.
Read about it. And that's not depression. That's like,
that's right.
For myself and other people. And I will feel horrible until it has been fixed.
That's right. Yeah.
And say a little bit about this, because I want to end, of course, the conversation with a cultural provisioning, which is your field and your mission and the subject of your three-volume book, but it's going to be 3 separate books, right? But I want to clarify this and see how you feel about this distinction before we go there.
I mean, we sort of touched on this, at the lunch to kind of set this up. And I'm just going to bring like one, I think, perfectly state public orientation to ground here, which is like, we were able to have a conversation about even like a physical sense that sometimes things happen that feel like a moral response. I think you called it like a moral like revulsion, right? And that was very helpful to hear. I honestly did feel relieved to hear and borrow and hold on to the language you were using so that I could scaffold an experience and process it. It was really like such a gift, And so it does convince me, like one of the things that makes it feel good to be like a thing around you is that I know all of those kind of intellectual thoughts live in your head, right? I trust that that you think many ways of thinking is good. And that therefore the kinds of, let's say, if somebody is reporting something like a moral conundrum, an ethical kind of quandary about how their life is, and if it is good, there's space for that to exist as a phenomena of interest, and to recognize that it comes up. We see it in literature, right, in artworks across human history, in songs, etc. So it's a worthy conversation in the modern.
And we all know these people, right? Like anecdotally.
Yeah, absolutely.
We all have a friend who is on antidepressants instead of getting divorced. We all know a problem who thinks that they're being discriminated against at their job because, and you're like, no, you're just a bitch, and you want to be a kind of friend.
Maybe we are that person. I don't know.
But then you're like, you think, there's this joke that we always say at my company that just because you're paranoid, don't think that they are not after you. So I always think maybe she's a difficult person, but she's also being discriminated against. Also, you have to trust the lived experience. And like you overwrite your completely correct gut reactions based on millions of years of evolution that you have, the causality of people's problems. And this is why I love gossip magazines. Like gossip magazines are always correct. They are at the lowest level of media. It's like, does Pierce Brosnan's wife, blah, 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 cheats on... I'm sorry, Pierce Brosnan, you're great. I don't know why I thought of you. Your wife is not cheating on you, I promise. Or I don't know, but I've never heard anything like this. And
I've heard they're a good couple.
Like, you can tell because she cut her hair. And everybody who says that is correct. We are not by birth, plasma physicists. You have to get really educated. But we are so good at this basic monkey level of what's going on in somebody's bedroom. It's just insane. We are geniuses. So trust the tabloid.
We really are. Right. Yeah, no, I agree. We love causal inference. We really do. Right. Like moral, we believe in a moral economy of some kind, And it's going to just acknowledge that people wrestle with that. And it can be good to kind of have time to sort that out. And so, and work on it, right? Work on a more refined machinery, like in community, that hopefully doesn't jump, so quickly to knowing why the suffering someone is experiencing reveals a deep characterological necessity. They had to, right, for all to be right with the world, because it's
and cultural provision in some ways is returning to these wisdoms, but in an actually constructive way, right? I mean,
my gosh, I hope so.
I would love for you to tell us about it a little bit more. Obviously, this is something that's going to be a 3-volume book, so not something that can be just, necessarily summarized in a couple of sentences.
We're going to try.
You will try. But I mean, you really have to for the publishing, right? I mean, there will be
of course,
and a jacket for the book. Do you want to tell people a little bit, because I think that you will be offering something that goes beyond the therapy speak, that goes beyond, only being wise on the gossip level. It goes beyond mixing up types of suffering and what the solutions might be. Just where did the idea come from? Where are you right now? And what homework would you give for our listeners to think about as they wait for the book?
Oh, that's so good. All right. So that impulse to tell stories about forms of collective life, right, that began, that fascination with media and design, that you could play with the deep stories we tell. But there was something about culture and collectivity that actually shapes how we migrate into new technological regimes. All of that for me meant that I needed to tell stories about organizations where you can see this. And maybe in a very contrarian fashion, I got really fascinated with organizations and institutions that we think of as where you make people. Like the big stories get set into your development and about how they had changed in the last 50 or 60 years, right? And to do it about very conservative, traditional worldviews. So I mostly work on American collectivity from the perspective of mostly conservative, what might now be thought of as partially right-wing, mostly evangelical Christians, some Catholics, but really this is kind of the world I'm centering on, where the idea of restoring something or sticking together is very loud and very important, right? It's at the core of the belief system. Nobody's hiding that. In a period where the story we've told about the political economy is about individuation and falling apart and fragmentation through media, through technology, through the economy, right? And so you have this kind of set of innovations that is playing with and experimenting with forms of collectivity right at the moment we're being told that institutions are all becoming more austere and impossible to deal with. And I like the tension of working those two things. And so I'm writing 3 books based on, at this point, almost 20 years of work that's set up like a triptych. So 3 kind of things you can view through in order to make sense of how can we talk about collectivity? One tells the story about the rise of megachurches, so massive transformation in the religious domain. Protestant churches like this didn't exist, and then in a few decades they were quite prominent. So what happened there? How did people learn to see the sacred and each other in a totally different material culture and architecture that, the generation before? So trying to track that piece, then thinking about how if you flip that spectacular big story into the household and think about families and family structures, this is also a place where collectivity is being experimented with. And that book is going to be about multi-level marketing, direct sales. So think Amway, Herbalife, Bill Ackman is going to be in it, because he's involved. And so the sense of kinship economies that are trying to move through collectivities and collective organizations to find ways to do accumulation and sort of capital work. So this is happening at the same time, often with overlapping sets of actors. And then I'm going to bend one more time. So I've got religion, household, to the school where children come from to complete the cycle of social reproduction. And think about the rise of classical Christian schools, the tradition of great books, the liberal arts tradition, maybe some of the ancestors that make What You Do recognizable to at least the American public, the cultural infrastructure that help people bounce back and forth between households and text and learning, and school systems that make people, ideally political subjects, that view the world a certain way. And so I'm going to try to get those three spinning so that hopefully someone who engages with them would think, wow, I could look so much more broadly than I do for inventions and innovations than Silicon Valley incubators, which are awesome, but the world is full of amazing experiments like yours, right? That deserve some really serious study and to be placed in tradition. And the second thing I would hope is that it convinces people that even when we've told stories about being alone and individual and apart, we've been working really hard at being together. And we can honor and value that work. And maybe that's the bigger stories that we need to be telling because they've been in plain view the whole time. Right. So that's kind of the work. I've started to try out a language, which I know feels maybe awkward, but maybe not. I don't know, about creative provisioning. So what if now we take that perspective and look back and ask ourselves, what forms of collectivity do we want to make so that we can have the ability to make ongoing collectivities in the future? How can we provision or provide for that possibility, which is going to require not rushing to an answer about what the good ones and the bad ones are, but really holding and building out an ethic of space for multiple possibilities that is precious because it's heterogeneous, partially understood, but not totally clear, not always for us or half for us, but that the creative work of aesthetics is figuring out how to do that, which is also honestly where I learned about what you're doing. That it's a really an aesthetic creative act of trying to provision conversation for ongoing conversation.
This is fascinating. I mean, you're doing the Lord's work, whoever the Lord is. What will be the title of the book? And can you say more about creative provisioning, just for our audience, in the sense that is something that they could also do? So if somebody listens to this and they think, I want to creatively provision for my community, how do you get started?
Oh, that's so exciting. So imagine a kind of like mindfulness, and that it's kind of a neutral tool. I can't say like, oh, you will be good because you do it necessarily, but I would say, imagine you set aside the zero-sum logic of deciding, right, that more of this equals less of that for a second. Just take that one belief and like put it aside. Maybe, right? Maybe this is a zero-sum situation, but probably not, right? You only get to use that like 3 times in life or something. And so that the way to arrive at the next steps of what you're doing with an organization, with your own practices, et cetera, is to look at that point and say, how can we hold open these options of multiple things? What kind of creative thinking would it take to do that in a way that's satisfying to the stakeholders or to myself, or that is within my integrity? And notice that those conversions and solutions are valuable, right? It's not just brainstorming, it's making value. Like that's actually an economic and aesthetic project. Even if you're an accountant or a bookkeeper, right? Even if you're somebody whose job is to do the things in the middle, like sales or bureaucracy, it's that creative provisioning move that keeps space going for multiple possibilities in the future. That's what I think we want to start to think about together and notice together and build examples for. So the book, the title for the first one, I have long intended it to be Mediating Eternity, but I don't know if it will live into it. So I'll say that with the caveat that it's dry.
That title, right?
Yeah. So I've been in love with it for a long time as a title, but we'll see. We'll see if it makes it all the way through. Yeah.
Creative provisioning. I love it. And I hope that, when you're publishing the first volume, you will come back and we will look at it, through the prism of reader reactions and maybe other projects that it will have quickly, led to or the project that it inspired. I know from Interact example that, if you get the right idea, people are so inspired and things happen really fast. I mean, Interact has existed for altogether around 8 years in different forms, but really 5 years, a little bit more than 5 years. And we already have like 5 marriages, and the second baby is about to be born of people who met in Interact. And, we're kind of slowly but surely building a village And to me, that's creative provisioning, you know?
You're like you
I
would be
love
like
it.
an ideal case, right? I think you're a hero of
I
creative
don't want to
provisioning.
do that. And when I
Absolutely.
try to hook people up, it never works. When I send to them a date, they never fall in love, and I'm looking the other way. I'm like, oh, okay, I guess they're dating now.
But you built them a world, right? If you want to eat an apple, you first build a world.
I think we are world builders, and I'm so happy that there
I
will
think
be
so.
a vocabulary and a literature of what we're doing through your work. Because as you mentioned, even megachurches, which is not really a recent phenomenon, doesn't really have. I mean, there is the book that I do own, and I forget the what church? I forget. The purpose-driven church.
Oh yeah, Rick Warren, right?
There's a book,
Yeah.
but all you get is criticism, which is fine. You know, everything public should be criticized in public. That's
Absolutely.
something good about free speech. But it's really interesting as well, and I want to read about it in a neutral ways. Or if you see a success story, I want to learn from it. If they figured something
Right.
out, I want to know about it, you know. And it's not necessarily going to be there in an extremely critical book that only concentrates on the negative aspect. I think for me, one of the big takeaways from this conversation, which is so obvious, and of course I know it, but I never heard it this way, which is that care is not always nonviolent. And that we know those people, right, who express their emotions through care. And it leaves you so powerless.
Right.
It leaves you so powerless because everybody's like, oh, she's the bitch, not accepting this thing. Whereas you know, because your soul is hiding itself, that you're subjected to violence, but it's really hard to, you know, find the right ways to say that. So I really thank you personally for saying that.
Likewise for the language of soul hiding. Like that is just a really interesting model. And
I just thought of it. I've been thinking about it for 20 years, and this is what I came up with.
It's amazing. I can't wait to read the essay.
Yeah, the Hope Access essay, it will be explored. So my outro question, and I have to ask this because I have to ask this everybody who comes on this podcast. So if it's the year 2030 and we look back on 6 years ago, which is now, what will be something looking back on this year that will seem completely obvious and logical, and of course about this year that we don't yet see, or that most people don't yet see?
As a whole people?
What do you think is something that we will talk about as obvious 6 years from now that people don't notice or see the connections yet?
Oh, wow, that's a really great question that they don't see yet. Give me a favorite domain, any domain.
If Erica is like, I have 100 on my mind already. Which one should we go with? I will.
It's fun.
Let's go something loneliness epidemic, because I think we never said this term, but we discussed it today from multiple different angles. So what is something that you don't know about the existence or lack of existence of the loneliness epidemic today that we will understand much better in 6 years?
Well, in 6 years, I think we will know that the loneliness story was never about the media, and that I'm going to be so optimistic.
Did you hear that your social media on your phone is no? Okay.
Right. Over and over and over. So, but this time, I think we have enough people whose eyes are on it from different perspectives that it won't stick again, I hope, right? And maybe this time, hopefully, we will think that the thing which is inalienably present is the social, right? Not the loneliness, but the teeming mass of connections that are always already there. Yeah.
I love it. And this is how I always feel about I always joke that every statement that starts with is wrong. Like you can't talk about everything. But also that maybe this statement is right.
True.
Yeah, I remember the 10 years given for how video games are making society more violent, whereas today video games are keeping boys virgins. Okay.
Exactly. I mean, I still haven't
Are they
recovered
out
from the
shooting each
thinking,
other,
you
or
know,
are they at home?
women carry fiction. Yeah,
The virginity.
exactly. Which decide?
I love it. Thank you so much, Erica, for coming here. I know.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
And I can't wait for your book. I feel like whenever I get somebody on the podcast who is working on a book, I'm like, I don't want to take up your time. Go back, write it. I want to read it.
Oh, but Anna, really, thank you so much. It's like such a joy to be in conversation with you. Like always, really. Thank you.
Same for you. Thank you so much.